Hello friends, welcome back to this 13th lecture in the course on the psychology of language. Now, in the last lecture we are looking at sentences and some aspects of sentences which are psychological in nature. Today what we will do is we will complete that section by looking at how sentence comprehension takes place and how syntactic rules which is sentence forming rules are learned by both adults and young people. Now, as we have been doing in all the past lectures, what I am going to do is take a few moments here and travel back in time and make the context or give you the context in where this lecture stands. So, we started this course by discussing how or why language is used, what is the need of language, and for that we needed to define the basic difference between language and communication. Now, communication is a form of language, but in communication a number of ideas cannot be expressed, and so for the study of language we started looking at something called the animal communication system, which is the most basic form of language. So, there we saw why animals communicate and how do they communicate, what are the methods of their communication. We looked at things like calls from vervet monkeys, we looked at honeybee wangle dances and other aspects which basically explain the idea of animal communication system. And further to that, we took a look at what the human language system is all about and compared between the animal and human language system. So, how the human language system has developed over a period of time. We defined briefly that the human language system starts with phonology or basic phones and how it progresses through the morpheme level to the word level to the sentence level to the level of discourse and further on. So, basically this structure of how the language is based or how the human language system is made and is used is what we were discussing. Further on we focused a little bit onto the idea of how language evolved. So, the evolution of language is what we were concerned in, and so we looked at the idea of how language would have evolved out of Africa and the idea of how the recursive or recession in language is used. We also looked at the idea of how our ancient and grandparents, great grandparents, they developed the language. And towards the end of this section, we looked at something called evidences to the fact that how language would have developed. And so, we looked at things like the use of proto language system, the use of Pitgins and other basic evidences which point out to the fact that how language would have developed. We also looked at the evidence from baby talk and how babies express their ideas, and so these provides us enough evidences to the fact that how language would have developed. So, that was what we were doing in the first chapter. We were just looking around and poking around trying to understand what is language first of all, and so how animal language systems and human language systems develop and a little bit of history. Now, if we have to progress further, we needed to explain what kind of research is done in language and how research is done in language. So, the next section that we did was on looking at research in language. So, what aspects of research in language are there? So, we looked at the science of language. We looked at the scientific method which is used for doing research in language. We looked at this method in terms of the theory, in terms of the hypothesis, in terms of how this hypothesis is tested by data, what kind of designs are used and all those kinds of experimental procedures which are used for doing research in language. We took the example of the evolution of N400 and how this fits into the whole idea of how language research is done. We then focused on experimental designs, what kind of designs can be used in language. So, we looked at both the between subject and within subject designs, and we also looked at some more designs which can be used in doing research on languages. Further to that, we looked at some behavioral techniques that are used for doing language research, particularly we were interested in measuring the accuracy and reaction time, latency and accuracy, and how this latency and accuracy give us an idea about the language systems of the brain, or how the brain produces language, or language processing, and those kind of facts. And towards the end of this section, we focused on something called the language on the brain. So, we were looking at what kind of techniques are used for doing language studies, how the brain can be studied by newer techniques like the EEG, fMRI and MRI, and how these techniques helps us in understanding language. We also looked at certain brain areas which are dedicated to language, for example, the Wernicke and the Broca area, and so that is what we were doing up till the second section. Now, once we had the tools to do research in language, and once we had gotten past the fact that how language has developed, we moved on to the section of understanding how speech is produced. So, we were interested in looking at how speech production happens, because the next step was to understand how language is produced and how language is perceived. So, these two sections of perception of language and production of language is what comprised of the second section. Now, in the second section, we started off by looking at how the speech is perceived, what is the way in which speech is perceived, and so started off by looking at auditory perception. How does auditory perception takes place? So, we looked at facts like what are the fundamental frequency and what are overtones, things like how the speech is in a form of wave and how this wave is measured, what are the measures of this wave, what are amplitude, what are frequencies, and those kind of things are that we were interested in. We also were interested in looking at the look and feel of sound, of how does sound actually appears both in the physical and the psychological domains. Now, from there we looked at we focused on to the idea of how the ear is made, or the conceptualization of the human ear, which basically helps us in perceiving sound or listening to sound. Then we moved towards the idea of what the speech stream consists of. So, basically what is speech made up of, and there we were looking at with the help of a spectrogram, we looked at how speech is continuous in nature and what is the nature of this speech stream. So, we will focusing on things like phonation, we are focusing on things like prosody, which is fluctuations in the speech stream. We were looking at the formants and the idea of formants and sorents, and within the sorents we have the fricatives and the plosives. So, we are looking at all those kinds of qualities of this speech stream, or these peculiarities of speech stream, and other necessary characteristics of the speech stream. Then once we were done with this, we moved on to looking at how this speech is developed in infants. So, what is the process of development in speech in infants? And so, we started looking at how the language learning happens in the womb. So, we looked at all those factors, all those evidences which are out there, which help us understanding that how the language learning happens in infants or within the womb. Now, we also looked at how newborns perceive language and what role does baby talk have in the perception of speech. So, what evidences can baby talk provide us in how speech is perceived, or how speech perception is developed in the infants and neonates. Now, after once we had been able to establish the facts of how the speech stream is deciphered and understood by infants and how they use this, we moved on further to understanding focusing on the theories of speech perception. That is what we were ending in. So, in the theories of speech perception, we basically looked at the motor theory, which basically says that there are articulators, motor movements, basically in addition to the movement that is happening in terms of speech hearing, and so they coordinate together to make speech. So, we looked at the idea of the motor theory, the general auditory framework, and the idea of direct realism, which are the three theories which have been given in speech perceptions. Now, once we have been cleared off all this, the next thing that we wanted to look is how speech is produced, because we have covered up till now up to the point that how speech is perceived or how one hears speech, and so we jumped on to the idea of how speech is produced. In that we started off that section, we started off by looking at the idea of the vocal tract in the production of speech. So, how the vocal tract looks like, the vocal box looks like, and how speech is produced, and how this of speech production basically is then transferred to different people who are hearing the speech. Next we looked at speech areas in the brain, so various speech areas and how they are combined. So the Wernicke and Broca area, what is the relation between them, how different connections from the Broca and the Wernicke area are there, and what do they mean. Next to that, we looked at models of speech production. So various models of speech production like the feed forward and feedback control model, the auditory suppression during speech model, the DIVA model, and the dual stream model, which basically explain how speech is formed or speech is produced. And lastly, we looked at the development of speech production. So how speech production develops in infants. So there we looked at the cases of babbling, the frame then content model, the social aspects of babbling, and how all of these explain the perception of speech or the development of production of speech in the smaller children. Now, once we were clear of from these two aspects of looking into the history and science of the language or speech, we started focusing on bigger issues, and that is where we dedicated 3 lecture section on words, because words are central to explaining any idea, to explaining any form of idea within the language. So, we started off by looking at the section on words by looking at the anatomy of a word. So, what does a word look like? What is the anatomy of a word? And so, there we looked at how words are labeled used as label for different concepts, and what are the different forms of words which are there. So, we focused on the content word and functional words, suffixes, prefixes, shifters, the phonology of word forms, and so on and so forth. So, we basically focused on what are words and what is the anatomy of the word. Now, once we had an idea of what words are or what is the anatomy of a word, we jumped on to looking at how words are basically learned. So, the ways in which the words are learned by people around us, and there we looked at things like how children of different ages learn different words, and how there is a initially there is a slow down progress, but then there is a growth spurt in word learning, and then it falls off after 6 months. So, we looked at those evidences. We looked at how mapping, fast and slow mapping actually help us in learning of words, and we also looked at how neighborhood density and in the semantic networks help us in learning different words. Now, once we had looked at how words are learned, the obvious question that remain is to look at how words are basically stored. So, what is the way in which words are stored into the brain, and there we looked at 2 different formats, or basically more different formats. And so, we looked at that most words are not only stored in terms of the pronunciation, which is the phonological form, we also looked at that words are stored into the mental lexicon in terms of the semantic forms also. So, basically we looked at how the words are stored into the mental lexicon. We also looked at how the cortical organization of this mental lexicon is. So, basically how this mental lexicon is arranged in the cerebral cortex, and we looked at some models of basically explaining it. And lastly, once we know how words are saved, we were interested in looking at how words are retrieved, and so that was the last thing that we wanted to do. So, we looked at word retrieval model. So, we focused on recognition and recall, which are the 2 methods of retrieval of any information from memory. So, we started out by looking at how spoken words are recognized, and then we looked at how spoken words are produced, and we also looked at several models of word retrieval, one being the leaflet feed forward model, the other being the Dell interactive model, and a third model being the so the 2 models basically the feed forward model and the Dell interactive model, and how these models explain that how words are retrieved from long term memory. So, once we were done with words, in the last lecture, which is lecture number 12, we started off by looking at sentences. Now, why are sentences necessary? Sentences are necessary because we can think without words and sentences, but for expressing our thoughts to people we need words, and these words have to be arranged in certain sequences to form sentences, because it is sentences that express us in transferring ideas between people. So, we started off the section by looking at the structure of a sentence. So, how does the sentence structure look like, and there we looked at that how the various parts of a sentence are amalgamated. So, basically what are the various parts of a sentence, the subject, verb, object, and we looked at how English treats it, this kind of a organization, the SVO format. We also look at how the agent and patient, which are the two actors, and the idea of the verb which explains the event which is connecting the agent patient, how they are assigned the text, the thematic role, and how this thematic role assignment and the idea of the subject, object, verb, they combine together to give us an idea of what sentence structure looks like. We looked at how sentences can be broken down into its clauses, into its various subsidiaries, into the SVO format, and so on and so forth. So, we looked at syntactic structures in which a language can be processed. Further to that, we also looked at how complexities are added into the sentences, and there we looked at how cleft sentences are used for adding complexities. We also looked at how a relative clause can be used for maintaining complexity in sentences, and we also looked at the way how a dative construction can be used for making complexities. Lastly, we also looked at how the agreement is necessary for maintaining, or agreement provides the complexity of sentences, or the agreement adds on to the complexity of sentences. Once we are clear of that, we looked at comprehending sentences. So, how sentences are comprehended or understood, and there we were looking at the idea of ambiguous sentences, which are called the garden path sentences, because garden path sentences sort of gives us an idea of how sentences are formed or how sentences are comprehended, and from there we come to know that there is a two-stage model of sentence comprehension, one at the semantic level, the other is the syntactic level. Then we looked at the idea of heuristics which are used in sentence comprehension, and we looked at the late closure heuristic, which is a syntactic parsing strategy that continues to add new words to the current structure until it is there is sufficient evidence that new structure begins. And so, we also looked at the idea of minimal attachment, which is another heuristic which is used for maintaining or comprehending sentences. We also looked at how priming and anticipation can help us in comprehending sentences. And finally, we looked at the idea of Broca area, which are the new evidences of the idea of Broca area, which says that Broca's area is not only responsible for the syntactic structure of sentences, but Broca area in a newer light with newer researches is basically a way station. It's kind of a working memory system which integrates the semantic and syntactic inputs of sentences, and how it processes these two input, and how Broca area, what role does Broca area play in this kind of a sentence processing. What we are going to do today is we will look at how sentences are produced, and we will also look at not only we will look at how sentences are produced, we will also be focusing on how do we learn syntactic structures. So, the two main aims of today's lecture is to focus on the production of sentences and the learning of syntactic structures. So, basically it is believed that sentences are produced, most sentences they are processed through two streams. One is called the ventral stream and the other is called the dorsal stream. Now, just like as we saw in word production and how words are produced, we believe that word production follows a three-level structure. Now, sentences are nothing more than just words arranged in the right syntax. So, a look at the word production of how words are produced will give us some idea of how sentences are produced. Now, word production has a three-step processing. The first stage is at the semantic level, where the concept when a thought is induced, the concept or the that explain that particular thought is first initiated. From there, the mental lexicon is searched for the lemma of that concept, which is the lemma is the abstract form of that concept, and all kind of endings, morphological and syntactic endings which are added to this lemma is in the second stage, and at the third stage these lemma is then sent to the phonological level where a pronunciation of the word is made, and this is how the words are produced. Now, if we extend this concept to a sentence production, we basically come to the idea that word as we produce sentences, information tends to flow both in the vertical and the horizontal direction. Now, the vertical dimension represents the flow of information from conceptual to phonological level. So, sentence production goes through both a vertical information flow as well as a horizontal information flow, and in the vertical information flow what happens is the information flows from conceptual nodes to the phonological nodes. So, basically that is how the words are processed, similar to how word production is. But at the horizontal level, at the horizontal information flow, the information or the horizontal information flow follows some models, and these models can act both in serial or in parallel ways. So, sentence production models follow basically a serial order, a serial model, or a parallel model. Now, what do I mean by this? A serial model is a model in which all processing of the sentence happen at one step, and it needs to be completed before moving to the next step. So, in the serial model what happens is the whole sentence, the whole idea of looking at the conceptual level of thought, then moving it to the lemma level where the abstract form of that word is extracted, and then moving up to the phonological level where the pronunciation of that particular word, all these happens at the same time. So, one sentence at a time, kind of so one word at a time kind of a processing. Now, in serial order what happens in serial processing, what happens is one word at a time is processed, and that is how the sentence is processed. The serial order or serial model says that. So, basically what the serial model says is all processing at one step needs to be completed before moving to the next step, and so this is how the sentence processing happens in the serial model. But then we also have something called the parallel model, and what does the, so basically in the serial model what happens is a strictly serial model requires the speaker to go from a concept activation through lemma selection to the phonological encoding of the any sentence before it can move from one concept to the next concept. That is what I said. So, word by word kind of a processing. We also have a parallel model of processing, and in the parallel model of processing what really happens is the processing is happening at one step occurs simultaneously with the same processing at the other steps. And so, here what happens is all words are processed at the same time in the sentence, and so all processing steps are taking place at the same time. So, there is a parallel movement. Now, it is a model in which the processing of one step occurs simultaneously with the same processing of the other steps. In a strictly parallel model, the concepts would be activated at the same time. And after that the lemmas will be activated at the same time of all the words in a sentences, and the phonological structure will also be activated at the same time of all the words in a sentence. But then what researchers would have found, or researchers have found, is that sentence processing neither follows a strictly serial order nor a strictly parallel order, but what happens is that sentence processing generally follows something called an incremental model. So, processing at one step is underway while processing the next step begins. So, most scientific evidences suggest that the incremental model of sentence processing is used. That is, we start a sentence before we have planned all the way to the end. Now, this is the parallel model. Now, we looked at this particular sentence, Indiana Jones is chasing the Nazis. This is the sentence that we have, and what we want to see is how this is processed, how this sentence should be processed by using the parallel, serial and incremental model, and this is the parallel model example. So, in the parallel model example, what will happen is Indiana Jones, which is the subject, chase, which is the verb, and Nazi, which is the object, they all are processed at the same time. So, in what will happen is at step 1 the concept of Indiana Jones, the concept of chase and the concept of Nazi will be excited, and then following that the lemma, the abstract form of this word will be selected from the mental lexicon. So, Indiana Jones, this is the lexicon, chase is plus ing, that is the mental lexicon, and Nazi is the This is the mental lexicon, and so after that we will have the phonological level. At the phonological level, the pronunciation of Indiana Jones is chasing the Nazis. That is how it is going to be processed if it is happening at the parallel. So, all three stages from right from the conceptual level where the concept is thought about to the lemma level where the most abstract form of that word is selected, and then add new structures or new syntaxes and morphological endings are added to the word. From there to the phonological level, each of this step happens one by one. Now, if we use an incremental model, the same sentences Indiana Jones chased the Nazi will be happening in this way. So, first the Indiana Jones will be processed, and while the Indiana Jones is being processed at the 3 level, which is the semantic level or the conceptual level, the lemma level and the phonological level, what will happen is, so maybe the conceptual and lemma level of Indiana Jones has finished and chase starts getting processed at the conceptual level, and by the time this chase has started processing at the lemma level, the phonological level processing of Indiana Jones is finished, and what will happen is at this point of time the conceptual level of Nazi would have started, and by the time we have the phonological level of this sentence being finished, we have the lemma level being excited and the phonological level being start. So, what happens is one sentence, one word of a sentence or couple of words of a sentence is being processed at 3 levels, and they are processed in incremental way. So, by the time the Indiana Jones, the lemma level of Indiana Jones is activated, the conceptual level of the second the verb in the sentence has already been started. So, this is called the incremental level. Now, in the serial model, what would happen is one by one. So, in what will happen is Indiana Jones, the 3 levels, the conceptual level, the lemma level and the phonological level of Indiana Jones will first finish, and then only chase processing of chase will start, and then the conceptual level processing, the lemma level processing and the phonological processing or phonological level processing of chase would have end, and then the Nazi would get processed at the 3 levels. So, once this step is finished, only then this step starts working and then this step is working. So, serial model. So, there are the 3 models of processing which are suggested for the processing of sentences. Given the fact that we use incremental model of processing, how far do we plan ahead? Planning scope. So, how far do we think, or do we let ourselves think before we end processing of the first sentences? So, given that spoken sentence production is incremental, psycholinguist disagrees on how far ahead we plan. Now, results of experiments suggest that we plan sentences one content word at a time, while other points to the phrase or clause level. So, basically there are 3 views. One view says that we plan at the level of content, the other says we plan at the level of clause. So, clause by clause processing, and then we have something called the phrase by phrase processing. So, these are the 3 kinds of processing which is there. So, data is inconsistent. What data would suggest is that either we process through a content word kind of a thing, or we process ahead, we plan ahead at the level of phrase or at the level of clause. So, how do we explain this inconsistency? So, the data points in all direction regarding how far advances in advance we plan our sentences, and since different researchers use different kind of procedures for testing this, or different experimental design for planning this kind of for investigating this planning scope, there is no consistency on how far do we plan. So, this inconsistency in data is explained by experimental procedures may bias the planning scope. So, why is this inconsistency of how far we plan? One is because the experimental procedures may bias, different experiments use different experimental procedures, and so that will be one of the reason. Also, planning scope may vary according to the processing demands. Now, some sentences are easy. For example, if you are giving a lecture in this case the cognitive demands are very high, and so we plan ahead in a different way, or we plan ahead sentences in different way. But if we are chit chatting, then planning may not be, planning ahead is an automatic process, or sometimes there is no planning at all, and so it depends upon the processing demand. And third is the different level of processing may have different planning scopes. So it could also be possible that different levels of processing may have different planning scopes. So the same sentences at some level would have a clause by clause planning, at the other level it would have a phrase by phrase planning. Now, the scope of planning at the conceptual level may be the clause, while the scope of the planning at the lexical level may be at the phrase or the content word. And so, what this basically says is that at the conceptual level, the planning happens at the clause level. So, planning at noun clause, verb clause, various clauses which are there, and while at the lexical level, the planning happens at the phrase level. So, we have the noun phrase, the verb phrase, or the participle phrase, or it is done at the level of content words. How many content words are there? And this is by clause. So, different clauses are there, subject clause, object clause, and that kind of a planning could have would have explained. So, basically what it says is that different levels of processing may have different planning scope. Now, also hierarchical structure in advanced planning makes general plan the highest level, restricts scope for planning at the lower level. So, hierarchical structure in so other processes that the brain may engage in planning ahead the scope of a sentence could work in terms of motor performances, or by looking at this. So, hierarchical structure in advanced planning is an actually a computer based program, and so what it says is that we make general plan at the highest level, restrict scope of planning at the lower level. So, once we make a general plan at the highest level, this reduces the scope of planning at the lowest level. So, whatever we plan at the higher level, that decides how the planning for the lower levels will actually induce. Now, the visual attention has its own say, or it gives us an own idea about gives us an idea of how sentence is processed. Now, visual attention we have seen before that how researchers use the visual word paradigm, and how this visual word paradigm with eye tracking to examine how listeners were comprehending spoken sentences. Now, this eye movement that people do in visual paradigm, that gives us some idea of what kind of processing is happening at the at which word in a sentence. So, basically visual attention proceeds sequentially as a series of if we are able to see how people are reading a word, and if we do an eye tracking, that will tell you how people are producing this sentence, or how people are comprehending these sentences. So, basically that gives us an idea of how sentence is being produced or how sentence is being comprehended. Now, generally speaking, most sentences has subject as the focus of attention. Now, it is believed that visual attention plays an important role in sentence production, and in fact, the sentence production in visual attention, there is some structural parallels. Now, when we open our eyes, a wide visual scene appears before it, but we can't take in the whole scene at once. Now, instead we move from one word to the other word through fixation and saccades, and this fixation and saccades actually define how sentences are processed or how sentences are produced. Now, generally speaking, visual attention proceeds through something called a sequential fashion. Visual attention proceeds through a sequential fashion as the sentences do. So, basically what part or which word, content word, do we make the subject of a sentence, that is explained by the visual attention studies. And so, visual attention studies or the eye tracking studies of visual attention task give us an idea of how the subject who is reading a sentence decides what should be the subject of that particular sentence. We also use something called referential priming, and so what is referential priming? Participants first shown one item before a full display is presented, and in picture description task, prime usually selected as the subject. So, in differential priming, what really happens is that it is an experimental procedure in which the participant is first shown only one of the items of the visual display before the full display is presented. Now, referential priming, they tend to direct the participant's attention towards the primed item in a visual display, and in picture description task, the primed item tends to be selected as the subject of the sentence. So, basically referential priming gives us an idea of how the subject of a sentence is is basically selected. Now, a number of other factors can also influence subject selection. So, how in a sentence the subject is selected? It is believed that humans are generally the subject in most sentences, and animate items or animate objects are selected as sentences. Also, we have something called scrambling, which is a syntactic process of putting the object before the subject. So, syntactic process of putting the object before the subject, and what does scrambling do? It also explains how the agent is selected as the subject. So, scrambling is a phenomena which basically says, or which basically explains how the subject is explained or how the subject is selected in a sentence. And so, basically what it does is, this kind of visual priming studies or visual attention studies tells you how sentences are produced or how sentences are comprehended. That is what the idea is. Now, if I have an active voice, Indiana Jones is chasing the Nazis, the passive voice is the Nazis are being chased by the Indiana Jones. Now, basically the two sentences, now what has run is, in this case the Nazis become, which was the object, now becomes the subject in English language. But what Russians tend to do is they use scrambling. Now, what is scrambling? As I said, it is the process, syntactic process of putting the object before the subject. And so, since Russian nouns have they are marked for their role as a subject or an object. So, it does not really matter from the word order, does not matter for the Russians. And so, if the Russians are rewriting the sentences, then the Indiana Jones or Nazis will always be the subject, or even if you change the word order, that the subject order is fixed. And so, if we use scrambling, Russians use scrambling, the sentences that they make is that the Nazis Indiana Jones is chasing. So, this kind of a thing is possible in Russian, but not in English language. So, basically scrambling is the process of is a syntactic process of putting the object before the subject and still making a sentence. And why does it work? It works because in Russian word order is not important. Now, sentence production in the brain. Now, brain imaging studies of sentence production are difficult to set up for a number of reasons, but a few have been performed so far and yielded results that are consistent with the current model of language processing. So, what is the current model? The temporal lobe is implicated as a lexical selection, and the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is the Broca area, is implicated as for syntactic priming. So, there is a dual stream model of sentence production in the brain. The ventral stream is what stream through which the temporal lobe, the lexicon selection happens, and then we have the dorsal stream or the Howe stream through parietal and the frontal lobe, where the syntactic processing happens. Now, syntactic priming can also lead to a particular structure being processed more easily, and so sentence production, this syntactic priming can actually help in producing sentences or understanding sentences faster. So, prior experience can bias speakers towards using particular structure. Now, if we do syntactic priming, this will help us in biasing subjects to using particular structures. Now, after hearing several passive sentences, participants are more likely to produce passive sentences in picture description tasks, and so this basically says that sentence production is affected by syntactic priming. Similarly, we have something called repetition suppression. What is repetition suppression? It is a reduction in the brain activity when syntactic prime sentences are processed. So, reduction in the brain activity when syntactically prime sentences are processed. So, when you show a prime, a syntactic prime before the actual word or actual sentence is to be processed, it is processed in an easy manner, and this leads to the lowering of the brain activity, or it makes the processing of the sentence easy. So, basically it is repetition suppression is that kind of a thing. So, once we are clear of what sentence production and comprehension is all about, let us now look at how do we learn syntactic structures. So, what is the way in which syntactic structures are learned? Now, we come in the infants and or we as human beings, we come into the world already familiar with the pitch and rhythm patterns of the mother language. So, we are very familiar with the mother's language, and we are very familiar with the intonations and the pitch and rhythm of our mother's language. Now, these prosodic cues, these intonational cues or these cues of up and down tone serve as the key for the infant to crack the code of syntax. So, basically how does infant learn the syntactic code? By focusing himself onto the prosodic cues from the mother's speech sound. So, basically then how does the infant learn this syntactic structure, the structure of how a sentence should be, or where the sentences are should be broken, so that meaning can be extracted out of it. So, adult speech are essentially adult speech which are essential, and those adult speech which are especially directed towards the infant, they flow in arcs of rising and falling pitch that stretch across groups of words. So, when we talk to infants, the pitch goes up and down, or it keeps on waving up and down, and these up and down basically called intonation. These up and down that we do in our voice modulation while talking to infants are basically called an intonation. Now, each intonational phase boundary, this up and down, the boundary between these up and down are called intonational phase boundary, is a prosodic cue consisting of change in pitch, usually downward, and lengthening of the final syllable that signals the end of a syntactic phrase. So, what we tend to do is we tend to use this intonational phase boundaries when talking to infants, and these intonational phase boundaries are the ones that the infants actually use to understand the syntactic structures. Now, we use prosodic cue signaling end of syntactic phrases and drop in pitch lengthening on the final syllable to actually explain or to talk to infants. When we talk to infants, we use these kind of structures or these kind of mappings and these kind of cues that we use, or this kind of cues that we give to the infants when talking, they provide the infant tools through which they are able to learn the syntax of a particular the syntactic structure of a particular sentence. Now, intonational phase boundaries are not always followed by a pause. Now, when we are talking to in adults, the intonational phase boundaries are not followed by a pause, which is very true when we are talking to infants. So, we give pauses, so the infant is able to understand where is the break. Just as infants use transition probabilities, now the infants use something called transitional probabilities to detect word boundaries. They also use intonational phase boundaries to group words together, and the use of prosodic patterns to identify syntactic structure is called prosodic bootstrapping. So, the infant use, just as the infant use the transition probabilities to detect where the word has ended, any word would have ended. We have discussed this in words, in how infants learn words. The same way the intonational phase boundaries are used by infants to detect syntactic structures of sentences. So, use of prosodic patterns to identify syntactic structure, that is prosodic bootstrapping. Young children sensitivities to prosodian syntax, they grow together. Infants use pause to detect phase boundaries. 3-year-old sensitivity drops in pitch, pre-boundary lengthening even without the pauses. Now, 2-year-old children have the ability to use something called syntactic structures to infer meaning of words. And this is known as syntactic bootstrapping. So, infants generally use something called syntactic bootstrapping, which is the use of syntactic information to make word meaning. So, for example, what is the content word, what is the noun, what is the verb, and these kind of phase boundaries are used, or this kind of syntactic information are used by the infant to get the meaning of the word which is being used in a sentence. Now, an example is that when 2-year-olds they hear conversations about a boy mopping, and they later prefer a scene of a person performing a novel act alone. But when they hear this sentence that a boy is mopping a girl, and later on they prefer sentences which involves 2 people, and so this gives us an idea that this kind of a syntactic bootstrapping is used by infants to infer word meaning. Now, children at the age of 2 also have the ability to use something called word meanings to make inferences about syntactic structures, and this is called lexical bootstrapping. So, what is lexical bootstrapping? It is the ability to use word meanings to make inferences about syntactic structures, and this is generally used by the infants. So, use of word meanings to infer the syntactic structure. Knowledge of content word guides children in understanding of the function words. So, what is the function word and what is the content word? These kind of facts help the infant deduce the syntactic structure of a sentence. So, between 2 and 3 years old, vocabulary and syntax grow rapidly in tandem. Now, there is also something called mean length of utterance, and mean length of utterance explains something about how sentences are perceived by the infant. The standard measure of children's syntactic complexity is called the mean length of utterance. What is an utterance? An utterance has been defined as a continuous speech or speech boundary by pauses, but it needn't be complete or grammatically correct sequence. So, it has to be a continuous speech, but it may not be grammatically correct, or it may not be syntactically correct. So, that is what an utterance is. Another interesting thing for infants is something called the number of different words learned, the NDW, which is common measure of child's productive vocabulary. So, this is how the children actually learn the syntactic structures. Also, speech disruptions give us an idea of how the infant learns the syntactic structure. For example, a stall, which is a disruption of speech that does not change the syntactic structure of the utterance, and it consists of silences or fillers like oo and actually explain the what is being what process is being is being evaluated in sentence production. Now, stalls are believed to be the result of crossing log jams in either the lexical retrieval or the phonological encoding as the child is incrementally building the sentences. So, this stall is explained in terms of how the lexical retrieval is happening, or whether the phonological encoding, or how the child would have phonologically encoded, what kind of errors would have happened in the phonological encoding. So, that is another factor which tells us how the infant is learning the sentence, or sentence comprehension happens in infants. Now, what are the various models of syntax acquisition? Now, there are several models of syntax acquisition. The first model of syntax acquisition is the generative approach, and which believes that syntax acquisition is driven by innate mechanisms. Now, Chomsky transformational generative grammar is very popular, and that is the baseline for this kind of an approach. Now, Chomsky took the position that the linguistic input children receive is insufficient for them to learn the language, and this is known as the poverty of stimulus argument. So, Chomsky believes that the kind of linguistic input that the children is receiving from people around him is not enough for him to learn the language, and that is called the poverty of the stimulus argument. Now, Chomsky views that adult speech is too full of errors. Adults make a lot of errors to be fit for a good model of learning. Adult speech is completely full of errors, and so these errors, if these kind of speech errors are there, they may not be the right way of how the child learns the sentences. So, what he believes is, he proposed something called the idea of the language acquisition device, and so he says that most children have something called a language acquisition device, which is a hypothetical module in the brain which is containing the universal set of grammars that guides development, language development. So, Chomsky believes the idea of the language acquisition device, and this language acquisition device is a hypothetical system which has its own grammatical principles, and so they favor the development of language. Now, poverty of stimulus argument position that linguistic input received is insufficient for them to learn the language. Why? Because the language that these children actually learn, they learn from adults, and adult speech is full of errors, and so this may not be the right word. So, what Chomsky believes is, there is something called a language acquisition device, which is a hypothetical brain module containing the universal set of grammar rules, and this guides the language framework. But then a number of researchers have actually opposed the Chomskyan view, and number of researchers, they emphasize interactions between general cognitive abilities and a rich learning environment in childhood for the development of language. This kind of usage based framework, psychologists take the position that the child uses general cognitive mechanisms like pattern detection and categorization to gradually build an understanding of the grammar of the language. So, basically there are no, the usage based framework says that there are no inherent or hypothetical brain module with language and grammar built systems which help us in learning language. What the usage based statistics says that the position is that the child uses general cognitive mechanisms like pattern detection and categorization for making his own grammar, and he gradually builds understanding of the grammar of the language. So, he uses these mechanisms, based on these mechanisms he is able to produce sentences, and this how the sentences are produced actually tells us how the grammar will be, or the child learns the grammar or syntax. So, basically the U-shaped learning curve for plural and past tense inflections, at first the children produce both regular and irregular verb forms, for example, walk, walked, and then later on the overgeneralization treating irregular words or regular walk, walked and go good. Eventually, they spot out the irregularity in irregular forms. So, child vocabulary and grammar develop through the second and third years, and they exhibit a U-shaped learning curve for plural and past tenses. At first, they produces both the regular and irregular inflection correctly, as in walk, walked and go, went. Then they begin to use this overgeneralization. So, initially they use this kind of a generalization, but then they start using this for a longer sentences, or they overgeneralize it, the phrase characterized by the treatment of irregular verbs as they were regularly inflected. That is, they tend to say man's and foods, comed and good. Even, and this basically says, this idea says that it is the usage based framework, or it is the use of simple structures, cognitive structures, to build to how the child learns grammar. Now, the generative approach is basically of learning rules, whereas the learning based approach, it focuses on learning of patterns. So, learning approaches says that hypothetical system with rules make us understand the language, whereas the or sentence, the syntax of a sentence. Whereas the usage based framework says that patterns, understanding patterns actually give us the ability to learn syntax. The generative approach views overgeneralization as the evidence for acquisition of a rule, and connectivist network, that is a computer program that models statistical learning, exhibits both overgeneralization and U-shaped learning curve when trained on plural and past tense inflection. So, basically the connectivist network computer program that models statistical learning, it exhibits a U-shaped learning and generalization in children's learning of the syntax. So, there is a stronger evidence for the usage based network framework comes from children's acquisition of another inflection, the third person singular s suffix for verbs. 2-year-olds are more likely to use the s inflection when the verb is at the end of the utterance than when it is in the middle. So, basically then acquisition of third person, and that says that the structure building is an incremental process in the infants. So, basically 2-year-old likely to say there he goes, but he go now. Difficult to reconcile with the rule based account and seems to be based on the ease of perception and production. Now, there is also something called correlation. So, further evidences that incremental structure building happens, or incremental syntax learning happen in children, comes from the idea of correlation. And what is correlation? A sequence of words that frequently go together is called correlation, and these predictable phrases are likely to be learned as chunks. So, sequences of words that frequently go together, brush your teeth or 3 blind mice. Young children will use these correlations, but say tooths or mouses in other contexts. So, when we are saying this particular correlation or this sentence in this format, children will say teeth, but in all other sentences they will say tooths. And so, this basically says that the learning is incremental in nature. Now, a premise of the poverty of stimulus argument in adult speech is filled with grammatical errors and incomplete sentences. Usage based theorists do not disagree with the premise, but they argue that this supposedly fault input is a boon to language learning. So, poverty of the stimulus revisited, usage based theorists view adult errors in incomplete sentences as a boon to language learning. English yes and no questions are complex. For example, is it training? Is it training? Is it training? Can you see me? Can you see me? He wants to come, does he want to come, that kind of a thing. So, a good example of this is the learning of yes and no structures, which is quite common in English. The basic pattern involves inverting the subjects and auxiliary, so that the statement it is raining becomes the question, is it raining. So, if we invert the auxiliary, it is raining, which is a statement, becomes is it raining, which is now a question, or you can see me becomes a question, can you see me, by just changing the auxiliary. And so, this gives us an idea of how this poverty of stimulus argument does not stand. Orders often use reduced form. For example, you want lunch to even want your lunch as a statement, and these basically explain the idea that the language acquisition device, the idea of language acquisition device does not explain how sentences are learned by infants, or the syntax of a sentence are learned by infants. Now, non-canonical forms are structurally simpler, provide scaffolding for learning more complex structures. Primacy of meaning. So, basically children learn syntactic structures that are meaningful to them. For example, verbs important in driving development of develop the syntax of a sentence. So, researchers working in the usage based framework emphasize the primacy of meaning in the development of a syntax. Children just do not learn patterns, they learn syntactic structures that are meaningful to them. Verbs are especially important in driving the development of a syntax, since it is the meaning that determines the structure of a sentence. Now, what kind of verbs can be learned? We have action verbs which teach canonical word order, for example, the SVO in English, and for example, mummy like flowers. We also can use mental state verbs, for example, teach sentence embedding, I know mummy like flowers, and so this kind of action verbs and mental state verbs are used. And we can also use, or passive voice is another area of language development where we see a complex interaction between a form and a meaning. Now, children's ability to understand and properly use the passive voice develops slowly, and it is not until around the 9 years of age that normally developing children can reliably use the passive constructions correctly. The meaning covered by a particular passive sentence influences how likely it is the children will comprehend it correctly. For example, often interpret passive as active. The cat was chased by the dog was chased by the cat. But this is not how the passive active interaction happens. The truncated passives, for example, the window was broken. Before full passive, for example, the window was broken by the boy. Now, the passive construction poses a number of conceptual challenges for language users, whether children or adults. One challenge is the strong tendency to equate subject with animate agents, especially for young children who is relying mostly on the meaning of the content word to understand the meaning of the syntactic structures. Such sentences are difficult to process and do not even begin to appear in children's speech until 7 or 8 years of age. Now, another challenge which is posed by passive construction is reversible sentences, and so we have looked at reversible sentences. So, we will not be focusing on that. So, these are some of the things that explain how children learn, what kind of errors happen in children's learning of the syntax. Now, there are several language impairments which are there. For specific language impairment, SLI, it is a difficulty using grammatical morphemes producing shorter and longer complex sentences. He is going to the store, or we play yesterday, not due to cognitive or physical impairment. So, SLI is basically a developmental disorder which is characterized by difficulty in acquiring grammatical morphemes in the absence of other cognitive aspects. Now, because English inflections and functions words are typically short and unstressed, there are some debate about what specific language impairment is truly a deficit of syntax in problem or perception. SLI is a perceptual deficit. Children with SLI often produces inflections at the end of a sentences, just not in the middle. For example, there he goes, but he go now. It is also important to distinguish specific language impairment from late language emergence, which is a condition. So, what is late language emergence? It is a condition in which the children are initially delayed in language development, but eventually catch up with their peers. So, children initially delayed in language development, but eventually catch up with their peers, and contrast with SLI, which contains into the late childhood, even adulthood. Now, language development in the brain, let us look at a little bit about how language development happens in the brain. So, language development in childhood stems from changes in the brain structures during the first year of life. So, developmental milestones, year 1 statistical learning drives language development performed by auditory and association cortices in the temporal lobe. By year 2 and 3, development of syntax with heavy reliances on individual word meanings, and ventral stream temporal to frontal subserves the semantic base syntax, and from year 7 to 9, the complex syntax such as passives and scrambling, and dorsal stream parietal to frontal matures. Language processing starts bilaterally, gradually shifts to left hemisphere, and as the brain matures. And so, looking at this, the fMRI study of a 7-year-old and adult, and as you can see, these are the maximum activations of different area. So, in all, what we did today is we looked at in today's lecture of how sentences are comprehended, what are the various ways of how children learn syntactic structures, how syntactic structures are learned, some of the theories which explain how syntactic structures are extracted out of sentences by children, and some form of how language disorders, certain kind of language disorders happen in language. So, we looked at not only at the sentence production in the brain, we also looked at how syntax acquisition or the idea of how syntaxes are extracted from sentences happens in language in sentence processing, not only for adults, but also for children. And we also looked at how the language developed in both in the adults and children. When we meet next, we will take another interesting topic and venture into that, and till we do that, meet again, it is thank you and goodbye from here.